Fusion rifles are a class of 4 weapons that utilize a charging mechanic when firing. Each of them serves a unique purpose and is fun to use. They do have the obvious downside of needing to charge up their shots, but they make up for it by having some sort of benefit. Starting off, we have Alpha/Omega. This rifle fires 5-round bursts that shoot faster and hit harder the more your shots land. This ramps up to half a second shaved off charging, and 50% more damage to your shots. The attached mod is PAYDAY. This mod lets you apply brands to enemies for 30 seconds that will detonate on hitting the reload button or swapping weapons. Note that I specifically mentioned hitting the reload button. The mod description says the act of reloading itself sets them off, but being forced to reload due to emptying the magazine does not detonate the brands. You can even just tap the reload key at max stacks to see the effect happen. Using multiple brands on one target results in the additional stacks dealing half damage. This detonation has a small area of effect. I would tell you how much it is, but it's not included in the description. Should you kill any enemies with the mod, you'll be refunded a percentage of ammo and mod power. The pros of the weapon are the stacking charge reduction and damage bonus to the primary fire, and PAYDAY, which can hit pretty hard if you invest into mod damage. The cons of the weapon are the very slow reload speed, the brand being projectile based, and the fact that the mod and weapon don't synergize well together. Like a few other boss weapons we have discussed before, this is another case of investing into one side making the other side feel a bit lackluster. And it's a shame. Just like Merciless, both sides have really good potential. What I wanted for my build was to try and stack as many total damage bonuses as possible. I even took off Leto's helmet for once, so you can tell I was serious. Getting it out of the way now, there are 2 components I will be using for all 4 weapon demonstrations. That being Archer's Crest and the Supercharger Mutator. They're not mandatory, they just help out a lot with these guns. Using Alchemist and Medic, we passively gain 50% total damage. Then I grabbed Ankh of Power, Stone of Balance, Lodestone Ring, and Burden of the Warlord for even more total damage. For my relic fragments, I grabbed range damage, mod damage, and consumable use speed. Overall, this build was fun, but definitely not optimal. I quickly noticed a bug using relics. After using one, there seems to be like a small pause where you can't fire the weapon. It was pretty annoying, but it didn't affect me too much. For mobbing, this setup is pretty good. You can slap 3 brands on a bunch of enemies in a crowd and wipe them out. Stacking all 3 on one target even lets you hit some pretty good numbers, even though you'd be getting higher ones with Archon. In boss fights, however, it was apparent that the damage wasn't all that impressive. The slow-ass reload really hurts, and the fact that you have to rebuild up the charge speed even after a reload makes our decision to split damage bonuses really apparent. It also doesn't help that you have to manually reload to detonate the brands. I pretty much emptied my magazine a ton and didn't think about swapping instead to detonate them. It was at this point as well that I realized Lodestone Ring wasn't really worth all the fights I was going to. The Lodestone Crown has a very small light radius, which means it's going to perform its best in close range. I did end up trying it against a close range boss and I think it performed a bit better. Were I actually incorporating swaps into the build, the performance would have been far better. If you want the weapon to really shine, just use a mod spam setup. It goes pretty hard in those. Definitely apocalypse ready, just stick to one side if you want to use it. Deceit is a very powerful split barrel rifle. After charging up, it fires 2 shots. These deal 180 damage each and cannot normally weak spot hit. The crit chance is very high at 15%, although the weak spot damage bonus is lower than average at 90%. The mod of the weapon is Ouroboros. This summons 3 swords to spin around the player. When you perform a melee strike, you'll launch one of these swords in the direction you're aiming. If this sword impales an enemy, every round from Deceit will deal weak spot damage for a few seconds. This effect can also be triggered by making these swords come into contact with enemies right next to you. This is incredibly powerful. Not needing to actually aim to land weak spot hits can melt targets with small or hard to hit ones. And for the few bosses that don't have weak spots, you'll absolutely demolish them. The downside of the weapon, of course, is the charge time. That is easily taken care of as we've just mentioned. Since the weapon is a weak spot melting beast, it only makes sense to stack more sources of it. For a build, I went with Hunter Challenger, the skills I chose being Hunter's Mark and Rampage. For trinkets, I chose Gunfire Security Lanyard, which basically extends our magazine by 50% with this gun. Xania's Malice because, of course, Probability Cord for stronger crits, and Stone of Expanse for even more range damage. For fragments, I was supposed to use the typical range crit chance, crit damage, and weak spot damage, but I accidentally threw on some other ones. As you'll see though, I didn't need them. So yeah, this weapon is really powerful. It just decimates anything that stands before it. Bosses like Kaeula's Shadow and Legion are no match for the gun. As for some tips, be careful when aiming at thinner targets. It's really easy to miss your shots up close. My brain kept telling me to use it like a shotgun, but it's still a rifle. Also, when possible, try and conserve your blades to get the most out of the mod. Obviously, some situations will require you to shoot them out. Just be sure your weapon is fully loaded before you do. This weapon is one of the best in the game, so it must be apocalypse ready. Savior is a completely reworked version of the fusion rifle from Remnant 1. It is now a slow charging but heavy hitting armament. Similarly to bows, this weapon can perfect release its charge shots to deal increased damage. And thanks to the 15% bonus weak spot damage and 10% crit chance, you can actually hit some really high numbers. The attached mod is Shatterstar. This mod reloads your magazine, makes your shots ignite enemies, and causes weak spot hits and killing blows to split your shot into nearby enemies. This split deals 30% of the original shot's damage. This is a super good mobbing and ad clearing tool. Oftentimes in boss fights, you can wipe out most ads that spawn by just focusing your shots on their weak spots. The two major downsides of the weapon are its slow charge time and very slow reload speed. And since you have to charge each shot, performing a slow reload only to then slowly charge up another shot can feel really sluggish. Now don't yell at me, but I went with Hugs, with Hunter's Mark and Bulletstorm like usual. The bonuses to fire rate and reload speed from Gunslinger turn this weapon into an absolute monster. For my trinkets, I went with Gunslinger's Charm, Xania's Malice, Stone of Balance, and Wind Hollow Circlet. I wanted to boost my fire rate, reload speed, and weak spot damage. Although, after recording, I realized the fire rate bonus from Gunslinger's Charm wasn't actually affecting my charge time. The reason why Bulletstorm still works is because it internally references bow draw speed, which Savior is pulling from. My fragments are as you would expect. Now I know Hugs is powerful, but I wasn't expecting the weapon to be this strong. Before this video, I was under the assumption that the weapon was weak, or at the very least just decent. But now I'm confident in saying the weapon is really fun. Shatterstar is at its best when you're in a fight that has grouped together ads. Fights like Custodian's Eye, Mothermind, Primogenitor, pretty much any fight where you get clusters of ads. Obviously, in one-on-one fights, the mod won't really do much. The burn dot it applies is pretty small, but for the incredible mobbing and ad clear potential, I think that's fine. Out of all the fusion rifles, this one is my personal pick. Apocalypse ready for sure. Last on the list is Bolt Driver. This secondary is the only one of its class that utilizes the charging mechanic. It fires 3-round bursts that hit for some pretty good base damage. It also has a free mod slot, unlike the other fusion rifles. The charging time and reload speed can be a bit of an issue, but those have fairly easy solutions. I also find myself running out of ammo a lot since you only have 4 total magazines to work with. Not really a flaw of the gun, since it deals damage closer to the higher end of the secondaries. One actual issue with the weapon is the bugged interaction between it and the elemental bullet mods. Normally, elemental bullet mods make your weapon gain the benefit of mod damage sources. Unfortunately for the Bolt Driver, the effect just doesn't work. This also applies to save your shots while using Shatterstar. A real shame, as I wanted to make a build with Archon and Invader. I'm sure it'll get patched with the next big update. So for now, I went with Gunslinger and Invader, Bulletstorm and Reboot being my chosen skills. For trinkets, I went with Gunslinger's Charm, Deep Pocket Ring, Gunslinger's Ring, and Wind Hollow Circlet. Combined together with Bulletstorm, these make the weapon feel like it almost doesn't have a charge time. For fragments, I chose ammo reserves, weak spot damage, and fire rate. And for my mod, I went with Overflow. This build was a ton of fun. Using Reboot combined with our deeper ammo pool means we have a pretty hard time running out of ammo. When you're in a fight and everything lines up, you push out some mean DPS. The bonuses to fire rate and charge time also means we can squeeze in shots between dodges where we otherwise wouldn't have the time. Just like the rest of the fusion rifles, this one's apocalypse ready. Thanks a lot for watching. Sorry this one took longer to come out. I was busy playing Payday 3, or trying to play Payday 3, over the past week. Next week I'll be covering the bows, crossbows, and Aphelion. Until then, take it easy.